Okay, hello, my name is Corey Chapman, or Riokaii. Um, I just graduated with my political science degree, and I wrote my kind of bachelor's thesis on my disillusionment with democracy entirely, and in favor of what is termed epistocracy instead, that I think would be a superior political kind of system for, uh, attributing power and determining uh, policy and all those type of political decision making in general. Um, this video is also going to be made as a response to the election of Donald Trump, re-election, I guess, of Donald Trump. I'll get to that point later. This is going to kind of be loosely structured, but only kind of through bullet points. It's kind of going to be off the fly, winging it. I'm not just going to read verbatim my bachelor's thesis out here, but I'm going to kind of try to walk you through the philosophical ideas and arguments that I presented, and hopefully they're compelling and somewhat convincing to you. I'm not entirely necessarily fully convinced of all of this. However, I think it's at least an underexplored uh, kind of critique and area within political science, especially. A lot of people, I think, kind of just take it to be true that democracy is not only a good political system, but possibly the best political system, and that there's not really any possible ways to improve it or any possible other directions that might lead to better results. And so I wanted to at least put forward an exploration and discussion around that. And even if you don't agree with it, or if I don't agree with it, it's at least worthy of bringing up. And hopefully, by critiquing democracy and finding the ways that it might potentially be flawed or, um, you know, has problems in some areas, ways to either improve it or other ways that we could take some aspects of these other alternatives and implement them in more democratic ways, all these type of things. It can be a mix. There's not I'm not necessarily saying this is a black or white thing. Okay. So what is epistocracy? Epistocracy comes from epistemology, which as a philosophical concept can kind of be thought of as the theory of knowledge or the theory of kind of truth, and related to our beliefs in what we think is true. So it's asking, how can we know what we think is maybe objectively true if that's really a valid and justified belief compared to merely an opinion or something, right? And what methodologies could we use in order to separate those two concepts? So when put into the context of like a political kind of system and structure of government policymaking, epistemology can be understood to ask whether we can confirm that our knowledge and political decisions that we're making are kind of justified, whether they're rational, whether we're using these epistemologically valid and sound reasoning in our decision making processes, and whether our decisions kind of are being made in these kind of thoughtful, informed, ethical, moral, nuanced, creative ways. And so epistocracy is used to define a society where, rather than the universal suffrage of democracy, where essentially, everyone has one vote, the power is very distributed across the entire electorate. Epistocracy is also termed as rule of the wise, compared to the rule of all or rule of many of democracy, right? It's not necessarily about the polity, it's about a more narrow set within the society, a narrower, smaller group within the society that has some sort of demonstrated, they say wise, but kind of either informed or knowledge or competency or whatever, right? In order to better make political decisions better than compared to, the general notion of democracy, right? Of kind of the wisdom of the masses, that type of thing. Um, so it's saying that the knowledgeable and competent are given more political power more selectively, compared to democracy. So, if we think that our political system is, leading to the best possible outcomes, how can we know that? How can we question that? How could we verify that? And the answers to that question, some of those answers could be kind of subjective, but hopefully I'll dig into that a little bit more. But I think most people would agree that political decisions and policymaking decisions are some of the most important decisions for a society to make. They affect a large scale number of people. They affect them on a kind of severe impact. Like they have a larger impact on the nature of their life, their material conditions, how they live, how they, their day-to-day lives, right? And so being able to examine the structures, and everybody has an interest in that being done well. That's also an important part, right? But the structures that both attribute and wield that political power, you want to make sure that those are in the right hands so that they're making the best decisions, right? So one question is kind of like, where do we make other important decisions elsewhere that maybe we don't use democracy for, and what can we learn from those aspects? So there's a lot of places where we make important decisions, and in a lot of those other places, we actually don't use democracy to make those decisions, because it turns out democracy is pretty bad at making important decisions, which is what I'm going to be arguing. But kind of hopefully we can use those examples in order to aid and inform how we should maybe reflect on democracy to actually reflect, I think, the needs and the wants and the desires of citizens, which is to have a competent government. Part of the problem is that a lot of our political structures under democracy, and I'm mostly talking about American democracy here just because that's what I know best, but a lot of those were built kind of before the concepts of like sociology, political science, and other kind of systems of collective organizing of people and decision making were kind of formally academically studied. And so a lot of those assumptions that they built behind those systems haven't really necessarily, they weren't at the time, I guess, necessarily tested or analyzed with a scientific rigor. I mean, you can go back as far as like Plato and Aristotle, where there was kind of philosophical debate over some of these concepts, but only in kind of, I would say, the last like 30 to 50 years, especially with the rise of the internet and access to social media and the spread of information and globalization and things like that. I think a more contemporary modern examination is very much relevant to consider, because I think the modern information landscape has kind of changed the environment, and it should inform our analysis as maybe we need to look at this again, basically, with a fresh perspective. Especially considering that I would say political awareness and access to information is, at all-time highs probably, and will only continue going from here. So that's not to say, of course, that, or let me word this this way. I think it's certainly agreeable that modern democracies have had their issues, right? And these have been studied and debated and all these type of things. You have partisan polarization, you have disinformation, you have all these type of things. And my philosophical and my thesis didn't really look into those, because I'm not necessarily looking at what are just the symptoms. I'm not looking at what are the current problems with democracy. I'm more looking at what are the fundamental problems with democracy, the ones that are true and will always be true within a democracy. You could imagine a democracy where there is no partisan polarization, where there isn't any disinformation or, malicious information being spread or tried to be, manipulated into the minds of people and all those type of things. It might not ever exist, but you can at least imagine it. It's not necessarily fundamental to democracy that it will always be partisan polarized or whatever. That's kind of a result of a lot of like first past the post plurality voting stuff. It's not necessarily related to democracy itself. And so it's conceivable that those might not persist as problems, and maybe future knowledge and understanding can combat those negative effects and maybe eliminate them entirely. And so I think those are good issues to study, but they're not really the focus of what I was looking at. One of the main things that I looked at and has been looked at, especially, is that voters are very low information. And there's a lot of kind of conflicting ideas and contradictions within the concepts of universal suffrage of democracy. So voters are low information, and they don't really see it as important to increase their level of information when they go to vote. And this makes actually a lot of sense, because the chances of your vote actually mattering are also extremely low. And basically non-existent. I mean, on the order of like winning the lottery or something, right? Like the chance that your vote will actually be what matters is minuscule. It's statistically negligible. And so there's not really any built-in incentive or pressure within the political system for people to increase their knowledge of how they would vote or vote more competently or anything else, which is one of the key flaws with democracy, I would say. And it kind of only gets worse as democracies grow larger and larger. One aspect that I think is very interesting to talk about is kind of thinking of how did political systems come to exist in the first place. And if you think about it, like in very, very old, like tribal, like tribes in Africa type thing, I mean, you had families, and then the reason that governments kind of came to exist was that they served a purpose. And so what that purpose was is that they were both peaceful, civil de-escalation and conflict resolution through the form of laws and agreed upon set of behaviors and things like this. So if you have kind of a set of principles that say we're not going to murder each other, we're not going to steal from each other, we're going to talk to each other, debate things or whatever, and that's how we're going to resolve a interpersonal conflict with each other, rather than just saying eye for an eye, I don't like you, I'm angry with you, I'm going to kill you, or I'm going to steal from you, or whatever. You can't really build up a lot of technological advancement when you're constantly having this tribal infighting and conflict. And it causes the groups to splinter and disintegrate and fracture and just kind of constant chaos of destruction, and a group can never really grow big enough. And so the reason that kind of these things were created in the first place is that having those systems leads you to being able to develop technologically, agriculturally, all these type of things. And so I know it's been studied that one of the most important aspects to civilization developing was the invention of walls, physical walls. You build a wall and you are protected within it, and you can't be attacked as easily within it, and you now have a firmly established geographic area that you control, that you can then develop, agriculture within and all these type of things. And so the way that I've always thought of this is like, if you restarted the Earth as a simulation and you had different starting conditions randomized, you could make 10,000 of these Earths or whatever. Would the Bible ever be written the same way twice? And the answer is obviously no. However, each of these independent cultures, and we saw this in the actual real world, the real example of Earth in just our one existing kind of practical application, is that these isolated, independent groups of collective, people, human agents or whatever, independently developed that theft is wrong, stealing is wrong. And I think in all those 10,000 Earths, eventually, as collective groups developed over time and advanced technologically or whatever, they would all come to that same conclusion, because it's a necessary conclusion for the development of groups to grow and to develop technologically. It's a necessary prerequisite in the first place. And the other benefit of this is, if you have that peaceful method of conflict resolution and technological advancement, is that then not only does your group cohesively stay together, and it can attract and conquer outside groups within itself and grow within itself more easily, but then also, because you've developed further technologically and all these separate things, you can develop more advanced weaponry, armor, stability, all these type of things that then leads you to conquering outside groups more easily as well. And so it's like, basically, a family becomes like a town, or a tribe becomes a town, becomes a city, becomes like a nation, becomes an empire, which becomes, all these type of things. It just grows over itself exponentially or whatever as you've introduced that stability. So yeah, political decisions are important, quality results are necessary. So the kind of two main concepts that I developed here, or that I used to discuss this topic, were competency and legitimacy. So competency, there's competency of government and competency of the electorate. So kind of the underlying theory behind democracy is that political decisions are important, but they're also essentially a kind of political violence. And so because everyone is affected by those decisions, that everyone should have a say in those decisions. And so, but the competency of government is kind of, are they able to solve societal scale problems effectively? And they're not just solving the symptoms of problems, they're solving kind of the symptomatic underlying root causes. And ideally, they're doing this also in a timely manner. So they're doing it without gridlock, obstructionism, of just kind of fear, hesitancy, resistance to change, or fear of the unknown, all these type of things. They need not only problem solving, but they need proactive problem solving. That is what a competent government would be accomplishing, is proactive problem solving. Whoops. And so if you don't have competency, a problem that is left to fester and grow within the the people, and they grow, the effects grow larger and more severe, and the awareness of the issue becomes larger and more severe and more potent over time, and things like this, if it's not being adequately addressed and solved. And that's determined by the people, right? That the lack of effective and proactive problem solving weakens a claim to competency. And then the competency of the electorate would be in selecting a competent actual government and representatives or policy making decisions or individual policies um, as a result of that. Legitimacy is sort of the belief from citizens that uh, the power within the government was determined by a competent and fair process. Here, I should actually probably move my camera a little bit so that you can read some of that stuff. I can't really, I don't know where the best place is for me to put myself. Okay, we'll go there for now. Whether it was determined by a competent and fair process, and that those who make the decision-making power kind of have a reasonable and valid claim to acquiring and holding that power. So a system with weak legitimacy would suffer from the ability for the citizens to kind of reasonably question the claim to those powers, right? And so this is kind of the fundamental like concepts of democracy. Here, I'll move the camera again. Is that the idea, kind of fundamental theory behind democracy, is that you have consent of the governed, you have an informed electorate, and it's also sometimes termed a deliberative democracy. So an example of a competent but illegitimate government might be a benevolent dictator. So this dictator not only does have the best interests of the wider people in mind, and is competent in knowing what those will be, and is implementing them properly and competently, but the problem comes about what happens when that benevolent dictator either dies or whatever. How do you determine who should be the next benevolent dictator? Who's the replacement, right? And that's when you have the power vacuum, and that's when you lead to all this, military coups and dictators rising up, and you might have not a benevolent dictator, but a malevolent dictator, an evil one, acting not in the best interests of the people, but in their own selfish best interests or otherwise, right? So, however, I would argue that competency is actually the superior and more important of the two, because if you have a legitimate government, but an incompetent government, the people will want it to be, like, the incompetency kind of nullifies any legitimacy, essentially. If the electorate is not able to select a competent government, then even if they did so through a legitimate process, it's not achieving legitimate results in their mind, and so they will dismantle that structure. Where the reverse is not necessarily true, right? So if you have a benevolent dictator, the people aren't necessarily going to rise up against it. They're not going to say having a benevolent dictator is bad. They'll most likely be pretty happy with a benevolent dictator until they need to figure out who replaces him, right? So because it still accomplishes improving the lives of citizens, it might erode kind of stability and sustainability over a longer period of time, but it doesn't have this like urgent, immediate spike of uprising to bring about like a revolution kind of a thing. So the role of government is essentially its ability to solve problems effectively, right? It's never going to be perfect. Societies are in a constant state of change and adaptation to the world and environment around them. And so what they do is they need to keep pace with the interests and needs of the citizens in order to maintain their demonstration of competency and their claim to legitimacy. There's a really good quote to keeping pace about this in the Jefferson Memorial, actually, if you want to look that up. So a dysfunctional government, which is kind of destabilized, causes breakdown in structures and causes them to like dissolve and reform and things like that. And so it's kind of in the shared mutual interest that changes in governmental structure are to be avoided. They shouldn't be messed with, essentially. Once you have a government in place, you don't mess with it, unless that government is so fundamentally incapable of fixing itself that it makes the revolution necessary, right? Because the time that you're doing the revolution is a pretty bad time, right? Chances are, if you're having a civil war or that type of thing and trying to start up a new democracy after you've brought down a dictator or something like that, that's generally not a great time for that society. And people are generally actually better off under the dictator, at least under the status quo, until kind of the revolution has been deemed necessary by the wider population or whatever, right? Usually after the dictator has been in power for a while, and slowly their ability to provide for the citizens and keep them happy either dissolves itself unintentionally or intentionally because they're too greedy or whatever, right? And so the foundational model of democracy is built on universal suffrage, right? So you have equally distributed power through voting, either through electing representatives or enacting policies directly through like ballot measures. And so they have a unified goal in kind of the citizens decide the things and the citizens are benefiting from the things. And it's kind of a fairly stable and sustainable model for determining the decisions within society as a whole. One of the best reasons for this is that if you're in the minority, and that a lot of this is also ruled by majority, if you're in the minority, you're kind of inherently in a weaker power position within the society. And so even if you wanted to try and overthrow the democratic system, it's like you're kind of gonna fail from the start before you even begin, right? Because you just don't have the numbers in supporting you. And so you're not likely to succeed. And so you'd rather just go through the democratic processes. And so rather than trying to destabilize democracy, you will just operate within the democracy and slowly reform it in a more peaceful conflict resolution, de-escalation manner. So it's a good thing. Yeah, this is a good aspect of democracy. I'm not criticizing that here. So yeah, these are, again, all the types of government and things like that, dictators, monarchies, things like that. You used to have like the divine right of kings was kind of a known phrase attributed to this, which is like, how do you establish legitimacy? Well, if you say that God gave it to me, it's like, and before people understood basic science, it's like, it's hard to argue with that. And if you're going to kill me if I say that that I'm going against God or anything like that, then turns out I'm kind of better off just following you, and I would consider that legitimate if you're in the mind of like, a shepherd from the year 300 AD or whatever. So there was this Darwinistic pressure, essentially, of social Darwinism to have power structures within the groups that established competency and legitimacy over time, tens of thousands of years at this point, right? And so the illegitimate and incompetent groups failed, and they consolidated power, merged smaller groups into larger structures, and these kind of properties emerged over a long period of time, right? Because it was just a basic survival pressure of power in numbers and stability and sustainability within keeping those numbers and retaining your group size and strength, right? And so democracy is a compelling answer to the question of how can you create a stable system of power, because you're in a power weak position, you can't really rebel against it. And so if you're defined as a resolution to a conflict that's, peaceful and all these type of things, democracy is a fairly compelling answer to some of those questions. However, if you look at it not from the perspective of how did this develop over time, but how, if we started blank fresh and we knew nothing, how would we best make a political system now? You arrive to a different answer. So, if you say that there are some people within society, and I'm just going to claim this is true, and if you want to argue with me, you can, but I think it's fairly obvious to be true. There are people that are going to be able to make better decisions than others. There are more competent people than others, comparatively, right? So, in theory, you would want the best decision makers to be in the positions of the highest power. That those people the power and influence of those best decision makers should be maximized to as reasonable as an extent that you can. Obviously, there's having some checks on power and just not giving them limitless power is a good thing too. But I'm saying to a reasonable extent, their power should be maximized in order to implement their best decisions, whatever those are, with their current available knowledge, in order to have those implemented as much as possible, right? And in a timely manner, as I already previously mentioned. So there's two aspects that democracy fails in this. One, in that effective problem-solving structure, when those problems are being solved effectively by the people with the best information, able to make the best decisions, that have been granted the most power and things like that, the majority of citizens would likely never become aware of a problem existing in the first place, right? So if you think, like, climate change, for example, we understood the basic mechanisms behind climate change and the problems that it would cause in the 1960s through the 1980s. And so if we solved that problem effectively, would we ever even get to the point of Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth in the early 2000s? Would people ever, the wider population, your average person walking on the street that knows nothing, doesn't pay attention to politics, everything else, would they understand what the greenhouse effect is, what the ozone layer is, right? I think if a problem is being solved effectively, those people wouldn't ever come to know that, and they would have no need to come to ever know that, because the average citizen doesn't need to know about what the greenhouse effect is. If we understood it back in the 60s and the 80s, somewhere in that time range or whatever, and we implemented proactive policy solutions to address it, to prevent it from still being a problem in the year 2024, that those people would never need to come to know that information. And it's fine. They don't need to know that. It's not an important thing. And yet, that's how deliberative democracy, especially, that the basis of democracy is built on that concept that you need an informed citizenry in order to solve problems. But by the nature of citizens being informed, it means that the problems are not being solved effectively, proactively, right? There's a contradiction there, okay? The second is that if you have some people within the populace that are more competent and better at making decisions than others, under a universal suffrage of democracy, where everyone has an equal one vote, one person, all that type of thing, is that you have maximally, as severely as possible, you have diluted the power of those best decision makers. So instead of them being, we found the 100 best people and we're going to let those 100 best people make the 100 best decisions among just what those 100 people think, we are diluting their power. We're saying you only get like a 1,000th of a percent of the power because it's spread across 400 million people, right? So you're kind of like contradicting the concept of like there are people that make more competent decisions, and so we should find them by electing them, right? No, because you're not even going to elect them because the people with all the power are the least informed of the citizens. The most informed people are probably very firmly planted on left or right, right? They're not going to move. They probably, because all those ideas are very contradictory with each other. There's not like, chances are the most informed, like best decision making people are not the centrists. Sorry to break that bubble, but anyway. So it's kind of an inherent contradiction that a democracy's electorate can be both competent and proactive at solving problems and informed and knowledgeable in solving those problems. Because in order for them to be informed and knowledgeable, that takes a lot of time because there's lots and lots of people and they learn very slowly, right? And a problem which starts and it might be only affecting 0.1% of people, then it grows and festers for a while, it starts affecting 1% of people, then it starts affecting 10% of people, and you have to wait a while, like decades, before this problem starts affecting even 50+% of people, and then when it starts affecting the majority of people, it's like, well, this problem should have been solved a long time ago, but now that it's finally affecting me, the 51% person, now I actually care about making my democratic voice heard in getting that problem fixed. But it's not until it affects them personally that it actually matters to them. And that's bad, right? If we know and identify the problem at the 0.1% level, and we can identify a solution of what it would take to solve that problem at the 0.1% level, maybe we can solve it by the time it reaches the 1% or the 10% level, and it never needs to reach the 51% level. So, democracy is a reactive, slow process for solving problems, and it maximally dilutes the power of the best informed, most knowledgeable citizens and their capability to wield the political power to make the best decisions, which seems very bad if you just think of that on the face of it, in my opinion. And certainly, modern aspects have made the ability for citizens to be more informed, like more able than ever. The access is at their fingertips 24/7. But it's basically physically impossible now for all citizens to be maximally informed on all possible conceivable issues presented before them of policies, candidates, and so some voters will be educated and informed on some issues, but never all or a majority will on all issues, right? It's physically impossible for all of that knowledge to even be consumed, let alone kind of synthesized by any one person, right? And so it's a Sisyphean task that is doomed from the outset. That democracy, it's doomed to fail, right? You're never going to have a truly informed electorate under deliberative democracy. It can never exist. So, my question is democracy used where other highly important decisions are made for a group? And the answer is mixed, but also no. So, for example, under academia of general, higher education, stuff like that, peer review, science, all those processes, you have qualifications of expertise and competency. You have to demonstrate competency in order to participate within the scientific, process of academia, right? And journals and publishing and all these type of things. So if you can imagine, you write a chemistry paper, it's going to be published in Nature or whatever. You have other highly respected career chemists at the top of their field looking over your work, verifying that it's correct, verifying that it makes sense, that it was done at proper scientific processes, all these type of things. Do you think, and so they decide whether that gets published or not, and all those type of things, what the results of that research are. Do you think if we introduced 10,000 random people off the street and we asked them to peer review that scientific paper, would we get higher quality scientific academic results? It seems obvious to me that the answer would be no, right? There's absolutely no reason that we would expect adding 10,000 random people to that process would lead to higher quality results. At best, it might just be white noise and completely meaningless and doesn't affect the results at best. But at worst, it just completely muddies the water. They completely get distracted by meaningless misconceptions, misunderstandings, by their own uninformed incompetence and lack of knowledge in the area, and it'd be completely illogical, and it would harm the process, and you would get lower quality results, right? That's the much more likely scenario statistically. And so the best case scenario is that you essentially, if it's the white noise situation, is that if they're saying thumbs up, thumbs down, yes, no, should we publish this or not, at best, you end up introducing all that white noise, statistical white noise, is that roughly half of them will say yes, and roughly half of them will say no, because they have no reason to make any informed decision one way or the other, because they have no knowledge of chemistry. They're 10,000 random people off the street. Which means that election is going to come down to not who are the best informed people making the decision, but who the least informed people are that can be swayed one direction or the other at the 51% margin or whatever. And those elections are mostly going to come down to coin flips. And if you think about this, in reality, it's like most elections in the US kind of come down to like 60-40 coin flips most of the time. There's a reason for that. It's because we introduced a whole bunch of completely incompetent, unknowledgeable people to the process, and this is the statistical inevitability of that. It's always going to result that way. Another example you can think of here is juries. We have a jury of our peers in the criminal justice process, and I think there's a lot of issues with our criminal justice system. I'm not saying that this is a perfect system. However, if you want to be placed on a jury, or you were going to be placed on a jury, you were selected for, you get your jury summons in the mail, you go down, you're in a panel of maybe, 50, 100, 200 people or something, and they're going to select 12 for the jury. Before they do any of that, they ask you a bunch of questions while you're sitting there. And they ask you, do you know the prosecutor? Do you know the defendant? Do you know the plaintiff? Do you know any of the witnesses? Do you know the judge? Do you have a particular background in the prosecutor's office or working for the government or for the police? Or, are you a known, do you have prior criminal convictions and you're part of a gang or any of these type of things? Like, they'll ask you tons and tons of different questions. Whether you have any personal history related to being sexually assaulted or any of those type of things, right? And whatever is relevant to the case that they can think of. Because what they're trying to do is they're trying to eliminate the irrational, unjustified people from having the power to be making that decision of guilt or innocence or whatever as part of the jury. Because the principle behind this is, if you didn't eliminate those people, and let's say you had a jury made up of any random people from the street, and they said, okay, you're going to have to determine guilt or innocence or whatever, and you're the person on trial, and they decide you're guilty because you wore a red shirt. Would we consider that a correct decision of guilt? The answer is no. If they decided you were guilty because you wore a red shirt, we would not consider that a epistemologically, rational basis for determining guilt, right? So not only would that decision of guilty or innocence be wrong, it would be unenforceable, legally unenforceable, because the basis behind the decision was incompetent, was epistemologically unreasonable, irrational, and unjustified, right? So in order for it to be considered legally binding and enforceable, it has to be done under a baseline standard of competency and legitimacy, which the voir dire process of jury selection attempts to provide. I don't think it provides that very well personally, but again, it attempts to provide that. So, in order for conviction of, prison sentences and things like that to be considered legally binding and enforceable and valid, it has to establish a baseline standard where the jury was not, let's say, unduly tainted by potential biases or unjustified reasonings and things like that. Now, you basically can't ask jurors why they made their decision, which I think is a big problem. And so, but if you can say that they did so on a racial basis, on a racial stereotype, or those type of things, those things are protected under law, and so you can get grounds for like a mistrial or that type of thing if that is found to have happened. So there are like reasons why I'm saying this. So if we're taking those concepts and applying them to democracy, by saying that the universal suffrage of the wider populace, the electorate, they're both uninformed, highly underinformed, misinformed, disinformed, and they're making these political decisions, politically violent policy decisions. They're enacting a form of political violence in the form of policies, and they're doing so for completely epistemologically, irrationally unjustified bases on all these different things, because not only do they potentially not even have any values or not know which candidate reflects their values, but they'll vote in opposite to that a lot of the time because of their lack of information. All these type of things, right? Is that those results should also be considered legally unenforceable. So the results of democracy are also kind of inherently flawed. They lack a sense of legitimacy behind them because we know how bad the electorate is in making decisions, basically. And voters in democracies, again, of course, kind of unconsciously recognize this. There's not really any incentive to increase your political knowledge. It's statistically near meaningless whether you vote or not vote, or whether you are informed when you vote or don't vote. And there's an interesting paradox in this where also voters think that the most important elections are the presidency and things like that, and national elections, where they have the least power, statistically, because of how many other people exist. But that's where they get the most informed, is on selecting their vote for president and things like that. But on the votes where they have the most power, because they're smaller local elections, those are where the voters are least informed. There's also a contradiction there, right? And so, voters don't act competently, essentially. So yeah, this is a response to electing Trump. This has been called a cacistocracy. It's essentially rule of the unknowledgeable, things like that. I wrote a lot of my bachelor's thesis heavily citing Against Democracy by Jason Brennan, and I disagree with a lot of his proposals in that book, but I took the underlying concepts of that as my kind of philosophical basis for the argument. Voters are alarmingly uninformed, and so the proposal of epistocracy is that we should find some other way to select for higher competent, better informed voters and give them the majority of the political power, and that we will end up resulting in better political decisions and decision making as a result of that. Interestingly, there's been some arguments presented by Jason Brennan and others that democracy is actually a potential way to do that. Because if you ask voters what things should people know when they go to vote, they will give you good answers. They'll say you should be able to name a Supreme Court justice. They'll say you should know what the background of the candidates is. People give good answers to these questions, but they don't know the answers to their own questions that they're saying people should know the answers to. Even they themselves don't know it. And so you can use kind of a surveying of questions like that, and then use that as a political competency test, and say you have to kind of as you would to become an American citizen, you need to score a certain level on this test, answering these certain questions in order to be considered as having the power to vote. And so rather than the right to vote being a universal right, it can be applied more selectively. Again, it could be even determined democratically how many questions there are, how many questions you need to get right, what your score on those questions needs to be. It can be determined democratically whether this question should be included or not on that test, and all these type of things. Now, there's of course a lot of historical issues that people will bring up with this, like literacy tests were used historically to disenfranchise and discriminate against especially black voters and things like that in the Jim Crow era. And I think the reasoning for that is that when those literacy tests were being made, right, they were being made with the intent to discriminate and disenfranchise, whereas these would be made by the people for the purpose of uh, achieving higher legitimacy and basic minimum standards for competency and things like that. Of and I think it would also create an incentive, as if you're a citizen, you have an incentive to then inform yourself higher so that you can be then given the right to vote by succeeding at this test, and things like that. There's been a bunch of other kind of um, issues that I talk about in my thesis of actually, going over the literature of critiques and other historical criticisms and things like that. And I think a lot of those are valid. And again, I'm just kind of bringing this up as something that should be looked at and discussed and fleshed out much, much further than it is. I was just kind of looking at, here's the basic argument. Here's why I think democracy is fundamentally flawed. Here's why I think some other system has to be better in some way. And so I think some sort of competent consensus where you have, once you've established or identified a competent group, then you look for a level of consensus within them. And so if they're evenly split on an issue, chances are the wider electorate is going to be split on that issue, and it doesn't make sense to give them any higher political power. But if they do have a higher consensus level of like 80-20 or 90-10 in some direction, that's very likely to be a better direction to go in compared to just listening to the wider citizenry, who's going to end up being 50-50 on that issue regardless anyway. Especially because the less informed the wider citizenry is, and the more statistically white noise they are, the more susceptible they are to those manipulation and disinformation propaganda manipulative kind of tactics and things like that. Whereas the informed, competent citizens are going to be less vulnerable, naive, gullible to that manipulation of propaganda and things like that to disinform them, especially in the event that they have developed a consensus and things like that. So how this relates to the election of Donald Trump at the end here is, I've seen a lot of discussion over the past couple days of how did the Harris campaign fail? What should we do differently? Things like that. And a lot of people say we either went too far right and we need to go further left, or all these type of things. And my answer, again, especially understanding the basis of my philosophical argument here, is essentially not that voters are too far left or too far right. I think voters are too dumb. That is the answer. It's a very simple answer, and it's an answer that people don't want to accept, but that's the reality, is that should the whole population, if you believed in QAnon, should you have the right to vote? My answer is no. You shouldn't. You've demonstrated yourself to be rationally incompetent to objective reality. You don't live in an evidence-based reality, a factual reality. You don't demonstrate cognitive, rational thinking capabilities. Like, you need psychiatric institutionalization. You need help. You need psychiatric help, and you need separation from your media environment, not to be given a ballot. That's my conclusion. And so the way I would think of this is that if the election was not for Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump, but if it was for John McCain or Liz Cheney versus Trump, every single rational person would still vote for John McCain or Liz Cheney over Donald Trump. Every single rational person, because those two are not fascists, and those two are not going to those two are going to uphold their oath to the Constitution, right? Like, that's the bare minimum checkbox one that they fulfill, and Trump doesn't. That's all the decision you need to make that decision. That's all the information you need to make that decision. And so the issue is not that Kamala Harris went too far right or too far left. The problem is Kamala Harris didn't go dumb enough. That's the answer. We need to talk and treat voters like they are alarmingly stupid, because they are. Like, they're idiots, like they're morons. If you say Roe versus Wade, you should not say Roe versus Wade, you should say abortion, because people don't understand metaphors or abstractions or jargon. You need to talk to them like they have a third grade reading level, and you say, I'm gonna fix this, and they won't ask questions of how. You need to treat voters as stupid, and that's the way that you will actually start to win elections. This is what Republicans have been doing, and they are actually right. I, for a long time, believed that you should treat voters as more intelligent than they are and treat them with respect, as cognitively capable. I'm completely disenfranchised to that now because there's no possible way that people didn't know what they were voting for Trump. I mean, January 6th was all you ever needed to see happen, and your decision could have been made on January 7th, 2021, of who you would vote for in the next election. You never needed any more information than that. No amount of campaigning could have overcome January 6th, and yet it did. Not because the campaigns were bad, but because the voters were dumb and they actively knew what they were choosing and they chose the dumb option because that's what spoke to them. So anyway, that's my conclusion. Uh, it's not a great conclusion. Um, it doesn't really feel good to come to that conclusion, but I've lost faith in democracy. I mean, that's what it is. So anyway, hopefully that was interesting for you to hear me discuss. I probably rambled a bit too much. But yeah, thanks for listening.